You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in the show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Hello, and welcome to another fine episode of the Hoosier Humanist Hour. We've got a bunch of people today. We've got Dee, we've got Caleb, we've got Chris, myself, V, and our sound engineer, Andrew. We've got an interesting show today. We're going to be talking about logical fallacies. But before that, just a couple of short announcements. As usual, this show is put together by members of FreeThought Fort Wayne, a chapter of the American Humanist Association. We have a new and updated website that's still being worked on, but it looks a lot better than it used to. FreeThoughtFW.org. Our email address is fortwayneaha@gmail.com. Our Facebook page, facebook.com/freethoughtfw. Before we start the show, I just wanted to throw an announcement for an event that we're putting together on May 25th at the Downtown Library. We have a free lecture by Journal Gazette editor Sherry Skufka, and she's going to be talking about journalism, journalistic standards, and just the culture of today of fake news, alternative facts, things like that, and she's going to help us sort through all that. So it is Thursday the 25th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. as a scheduled time at the downtown Allen County Public Library. So it'll be a great lecture, I think, and it should be good times. So how's everybody doing?
Doing great.
Yeah, doing great, man. Thanks.
Good. So you guys ready to talk about some fallacies?
Absolutely.
Heck yeah. Let's do this.
I think Chris is going to kind of lead this, so I'll leave it in your capable hands.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, thanks. This is an awesome topic, so we'll get right into it. So fallacies, I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand, what is this weird term, the fallacies. Obviously, it sounds like it comes from the root word false or falsehoods, and that would be a good inductive guess. So there's just all of these resources out there online from highly reputable sources, universities, and all kinds of places where you can find out about what a fallacy is. But so I just grabbed a quick description from a great website called nizkor.org, nizkor.org. And it's dedicated to kind of conglomerating fallacies and helping people understand what that is. And they say that in order to understand what a fallacy is, first you have to understand what an argument is. So very briefly, an argument is one or more premises, things that we're using for support, and that reaches a conclusion. And so a premise is a statement that it's either true or false, or that is offered in support of the claim. And the conclusion, which is also a sentence, is either true or false. So that's what an argument basically is. And Aristotle was the first philosopher to kind of pioneer the idea of logic and argumentation and fallacies. And he said there are two main types of arguments. We have deductive and inductive arguments. So deductive arguments are arguments that have premises that provide complete support for the conclusion. Whether or not that conclusion is true or false, they lead to a logical truth or falsehood. An inductive argument is one where the premises provide a degree of support, but leave some room for doubt. And that amount of doubt dictates whether or not it is a strong argument or a weak inductive argument. So what is a fallacy? Well, basically a fallacy is any error in reasoning. And it's a little different from a factual error, because a factual error is really just being wrong about the facts. It's having, we don't have alternative facts, it's just being wrong about it. So to be more specific, a fallacy is an argument in which the premises given for the conclusion do not provide the needed degree of support. There's some other terminology that really gets into the meat of it, but that's basically it. It's when you have an argument that doesn't provide enough support for the conclusion. And there's so many different ways to find that. So tonight, I guess we're going to talk a little bit about what those fallacies can be, where we might find them, and why it's important that we kind of are able to recognize some of these. So first off, why are they important? Well, my initial reasoning, and I'll leave it open to you guys to kind of chime in, but my initial reasoning on why fallacies are important draws me back to when we were thinking about biases. Biases, we said, were when we kind of see things and we interpret them in a way that we may not be aware that we're interpreting them, and it can lead us into some areas where we're thinking in error. Well, fallacies to me are often how we communicate those biases. They're when we start to present our arguments for why we think a certain way, we can often discover that we have a biased view when we start to identify those errors in logic. So when we're able to identify those fallacies, it actually can be a really good thing, because it can help us kind of avoid those false thinking practices. So they can lead us to false thinking, but they can also make us better thinkers, just like road construction signs warn us of areas we don't really want to be driving in. I don't know. Why do you guys think fallacies might be important?
Well, it almost sounds like, if you can understand better the logical process of, your premises to reaching the conclusion, you can avoid your own internal biases. So, the way I understand it, the fallacies are, reasoning mistakes, where biases are more like how we take in the information, what information we seek for. And so, oftentimes we see someone on TV, we see an interview, and maybe they have a couple people on there with opposing views. If you're able to understand the fallacies, you may be able to better determine who to trust more, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think the ability to the ability to identify fallacies as they're coming at you is really a way to help get you to see the forest for the trees. It allows you to find more efficient ways of determining whether or not something that's being fed to you is likely to be true or not. So it's likely to lead people to change their opinions on things when they find out that they have fallacious lines of reasoning. It happened for me. I'm sure it's happened for just about everybody, I can imagine.
Oh yeah, definitely. Can you guys, or Chris, can you give me some examples of fallacies, especially for our listeners?
Oh, absolutely.
It's hard to know exactly what we're talking about without having some clear idea of what a fallacy is. And I think a lot of people out there probably don't know what a fallacy is.
Sure. Well, so let's start with just some fun, easy ways to understand what a fallacy might look like, although they're often a little bit more difficult to identify because often they seem like they might be good arguments. But I'll give you some examples of some that are just pretty easy to understand. So, for example, if I said that here's my two supports, my two premises. The word dog has the letters D, O, and G. Would you say that's a true statement?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a true premise. Now, if I said the word God has the letters D, O, and G, would you say that's a true statement?
Sure.
Okay, so then if I take those two premises and I lead them, I derive the conclusion, the logical conclusion that because both of those words contain the letters D, O, and G, they are the same thing. Would that be a logical conclusion?
It works, kind of.
Yeah.
It works. So we can say that it's a valid reasoning, but it's an unsound conclusion. Unsound means that both the premises are true and the conclusion is also true. So it's unsound. It's a fallacy of equation. I'm making a false equation saying that because these, or actually a false oversimplification, because these two things have these same letters, obviously they have to be the same things. Well, we can both agree that those two concepts are still vastly different. A dog and a particular deity have nothing else really in common other than the letters.
Yeah, well, you can prove the statement wrong as well. I mean, all you have to do is point to DNA. There are only 4 letters there, but everything that has DNA isn't the same thing.
True. So that's kind of a really, really simple way to look at a fallacy, but there's so many other examples. For example, we can point to the fallacy of what they call an ad hominem attack, where if I say, well, obviously you should not buy a car from that person because he lied to me last week. Well, he may have lied to me last week, but really I'm not challenging why I should buy a car from that person. I'm just saying that I don't like this person and he lied to me. It doesn't actually have anything to do with whether or not I should buy a car or you should buy a car from him, but I'm attacking his person. I'm attacking his character. So there's appeal to authority, where we often see them on advertisements, where you see somebody pop up in a lab coat that says, you should buy this product because I'm a doctor and I say it's great. When we really don't have any information about whether or not that person is an expert in the field of whatever he's selling, or whether or not the rest of the scientific consensus shares that view, or whether or not the research is even sound, we're just being asked to accept this person's authority based on their authority alone. So that's another very common fallacy that we see often. But the difficult part is that there are to date, there's over 240 different identified fallacies, because really a fallacy is just a common error in logic.
Well, do you mind if I ask you about the appeal to authority one? To me, it seems like this one's really only fallacious if you want to use it logically. But I mean, if you want to reasonably use an appeal to authority, you wouldn't necessarily be in error to do so. I mean, if there's only... I mean, is there some sort of... I mean, where do you draw the line, basically?
That's a great question.
Well, I think I was going to say,
go ahead.
On that question, you just know that there's a line to draw, I guess. I mean, that piece of information in and of itself can be really powerful.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Anyway,
the other that is that it comes down to whether or not the argument itself is true, and whether or not it's creating a strong enough or a cogent enough argument to support the appeal to authority. So if I say, hey, I'm a doctor, I've studied this material, I can show you my credentials, I can show you the papers I've published and these things, then you have every reason to believe that I hold a respectable authority on that topic. And then, sure, you can definitely take strength in understanding or in believing what I say. But when we appeal to authority based on authority alone, for example, if I said, and I'm going to make a dig here, I'm sorry, but if I said, climate change is not real, you should believe me because I'm the president. These two the topic and the authority are not intrinsically tied together, and there's no other argument being given for why I should believe that. So it's difficult to accept it based on the authority or the perception of authority alone.
Yeah, and it's even more subtle than that. For example, you know, I'm an engineer, and I may make some statement that, oh, there's no way that this machine will work. Trust me, I'm an engineer. Yeah, but what kind of engineer am I? Am I electrical? Am I mechanical? Am I a civil engineer? Am I a biomedical engineer? Am I a chemical engineer? You know, I may, you know, it's very subtle sometimes. And even, let's say it's an electrical machine and I'm an electrical engineer, there's a lot of subcategories where I may be qualified to give my opinion and I may not be. So the appeal to authority fallacy can be very, very subtle in some cases and very blatant in other cases. So that's a hard one to digest, and it really takes some digging into the credentials of the people who's saying it, you know, motivations that they may have, and all that to figure out, you know, whether a person is trustworthy or not.
And really, doesn't this just it seems like the elephant in the room is like religion. Religion is a wonderful place to start with that fallacy. I mean,
well, you're going to hear pretty much fallacious argument after fallacious argument more often than not in politics and religion, and more often in religion than anything else in the debate realm. Even just in colloquial conversation, even. I mean, you're going to find this everywhere, especially once you start looking for it, which I've been doing for a while. It's kind of driving me nuts.
I should say too, like these, what causes these fallacies? What causes us to buy these fallacies so easily? Is it just, it's the genetic question? Is it genetic or is it cultural?
Because I'm going to go with heuristics on this one, man.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, I think go ahead. I was going to say, I think you're absolutely onto it, and I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. Heuristics being one, because we do have to be able to make quick decisions without, we can't possibly always be looking into the credentials of an expert and, you know, digging into their background to make sure that all of their research paper was unflawed. You know, we have to make those heuristic choices, but we also have environments that we grow up in. So there's a nurture component that may lead us towards being a little bit more aware of those fallacies or being more willing to accept things as they are. There may also, I don't know, I'm not a geneticist, but there might be a genetic nature component to it as well. I'd love to see some ideas on that, but it's regardless of those. I think you touch on an interesting idea that there's, you know, we feel like there's all these things out there, and what do we have out there to help us with identifying these fallacies? And luckily, there are several tools out there available all over the place. It reminds me of Carl Sagan when he used to talk about the baloney detection kit.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And it really was just he had a collection of a few very popular fallacies that he looked out for, and he also had a few ways to question the input that he was getting. And he said, you know, once you start to develop those basic principles, it really helps you start to see where some of those fallacies may be, even if you don't recognize exactly what they are.
It's an interesting chicken or egg conundrum too. Like, what comes first, the bias or the fallacy?
Yeah.
I had that really interesting point in the beginning where you said fallacies are us communicating a bias. I just think that that's really interesting how we use the fallacies as a reinforcement of our bias, or do they cause the bias or
Well,
contribute to it?
Yeah,
I guess
think
both.
I think our biases are fed by fallacies that we perceive and that we accept because of the biases we have pre-existing.
Well, I mean, a fallacy is something that is apt to lead to illogical lines of reasoning. So, I mean, pretty much any time that you discover a way to find out that something is wrong, you've just discovered a fallacy or a way of discovering a fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in that sense, anything that you believe that's wrong, whether you are aware of it or not, is fallacious in and of itself.
Well, and if you or at least you should be looking for fallacies, because it also could be a good indicator of whether or not you might be wrong about your perception.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking for fallacy in where you're thinking something is wrong, and you can't find any fallacy, then you might want to re-examine your previous reasons for thinking something was wrong. You might find fallacies there.
A subtle difference, I think, that makes that can be important here between fallacies and biases is, I think, almost exclusively biases are subconscious. You're not oftentimes aware of your biases, where fallacies can be subconscious in the sense that you may not be aware that you're committing a fallacy when you're making an argument. But I think, for example, in political discussions or stuff like that, oftentimes those fallacies are committed very deliberately with subtlety in order to try to convince people of your point, even when you know you're wrong. And you would do that for political reasons, for economic gain, for just multiple different reasons, probably.
Sure. Well, and so I'm sorry. I think I kind of wandered away from your original question of when do these things kind of start? And I would say that it kind of starts in a misunderstanding of how to create logical arguments, and or just an unknowing, not knowing how to create or perceive logical arguments. That's where we start to see fallacies happen, usually accidentally. Usually people don't intend to do them, but they often seem to make sense even when they don't.
Well, some of these... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say another really good example of a very common fallacy is a slippery slope. Probably a lot of people have heard of that. And sometimes it's even misused. Sometimes it's used fallaciously in order to attack other arguments being proposed for certain things. But a slippery slope is when you say that if we do A, then Z will consequently happen too. Therefore, we should not do A. But we have never really proven the link between any of the points in between. We're just allowing that to snowball and kind of slide down the slope.
Oh, you mean like God?
Boy, that is like the ultimate example of the slippery slope. That car missed me in an accident. There must be a God. Boy, what a week.
There's a lot between. There's a lot. Well, and that's also another one. Man, that brings into begging the question. Begging the question is a fallacy. So if you say, if I don't believe in God, I will go to hell. That begs the question. What if God's not real?
Yes.
So, there's just so many, but there's a ton that we could go through just for fun. Some of the biggest one, bandwagon fallacy, the gambler's fallacy, begging the question. The appeal to nature is one of my favorite ones. It's natural, so it's good for you. Well, terror attacks are natural. cyanide is natural. I don't think I want either one of those things to happen to me. Okay?
Ooh, let's try this one then, because this one comes up a lot. This one's really common. The false dichotomy.
Yes.
As soon as you start looking for this, if you didn't know it existed before, it's going to change your world. I promise you, because this is one of the most common fallacies that's used everywhere on all sides. To be fair,
What they called again?
It's called the false dichotomy.
Is that the same as the false dilemma?
Yes.
Okay. I'm looking these up.
Yeah, there's the false dilemma is also another name for this fallacy. Basically, a false dichotomy is incorrectly assuming that a choice is to be made between one of only two possibilities, when in fact there might actually be other options. So this particular fallacy can be quite damaging for people who don't know to look for it.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah. It creates the framework for an argument in such a way that it appears that there are only two options, when there are in fact more options. So if you're not looking for it, you tend to get trapped into that. This is something that a lot of magicians and politicians and those people who claim to be able to read your mind or make your mind do things, pretty much, if you want to try to trick somebody, this is a very common trick to use. Okay, so example. Let's give an example here. I'll use a religious one because it's my favorite. If God didn't create the universe, then who did? Okay, so that's a very common, popular question.
Very.
This question, however, assumes that either A, God did it, or B, someone other than God did it.
Right.
When in fact it might be possible that nobody did it. It happened on its own, or perhaps more than one person's. But regardless, this is a fallacious line of reasoning, and it's something that I hope that I honestly hope that there's one person listening who's never heard of this.
Yeah.
And look for this everywhere. Anytime someone gives you one of two options, just think about the fact that there might be a third, and try to think about that.
Sure. Well, another one that I like, that unfortunately my father even falls prey to, is in the false dilemma, is you can't win if you don't play. The lottery question. They often say, well, if you don't play it, you can't win that lottery. You can't win it big. When really you're given two choices. You either play or you don't play. But really, there might be other options. There might be the option to not play and consider it a win automatically. You get to save $1. So it ignores any other potential perspective that might change the way you're thinking about something.
Yeah. It's also called black and white thinking.
Yeah.
Too. It's another way of looking at it. And that's huge in religion, because when you believe that everything is created for a reason, then you just think that there's a will or an intention for everything. When it comes to morality, and it's totally terribly damaging to look at the world that way. It causes all kinds of division with other people who are different, but it doesn't mean that they're bad or evil. It just has a huge effect on society, my opinion.
Well, in our society, one very common false dichotomy is you're either conservative or you're liberal.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
And that's a huge one. We stick these labels to people, and you can't get away from it. Oh, you're a conservative. How can you be in support of gay marriage? Well, it's a false dichotomy that all these things fall in this category or that category.
Yeah, it causes a lot of division when it doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, well, actually, now that you mention it, we see it. I'm seeing so many places where we also see it. We also see it where in how we see others, particularly in competitive environments. You're either with me or against me.
Right.
Which may not necessarily be the case. Or a lot of people see it in self-image when they say, oh, I've got to be positive, or nothing positive will happen. Well, or if I'm negative, then only negative things are going to happen. that may not necessarily be the case, but we often perceive it that way. And so we get trapped into thinking that it makes common sense that that's the case. Yeah, that's just really neat to me how that one pops up everywhere.
It makes you, it's almost like it's your brain's attempt to make it feel like it knows something.
Yeah.
Just having some sort of surety about something is comforting. So you can create these dichotomies where you're like, well, it must be this or it must not be that, and that at least gives you some basis for what you feel is stable ground mentally to stand on. It's so hard to leave religion and enter the void of being okay with not knowing. Mm-hmm. It's a huge leap to do that with all sorts of stuff outside of religion, just all the religion, politics, your relationships, any belief or view that you've held strongly onto. It's worth looking at the opposing argument too, at least to see if there's some merit to it. Anyway, I'm rambling on.
Yeah. Admitting that I don't know is a good answer is very tough for some people. Very tough for some people.
And it makes it. Here's one that makes that even a little bit more difficult too, because there's not always just like, because we've talked about the false dichotomy, how there's not always just one answer, and how things are often more complex, but fallacies can get a little bit tricky because there's other fallacies that almost sometimes tend to or feel like they contradict each other. One's called the middle ground fallacy, which is saying that a compromise or a middle point between two extremes must be the truth. And often when we overthink things, we tend to say, well, it's got to be somewhere in the middle. It can't be this one choice or this other choice. Those are the two extremes. I've got to be able to find something in the middle. When we do have to also be open to the idea that maybe it is one of those extremes. And that sounds like we're contradicting ourselves, but we have to keep in mind that it's really about finding strong logical support for our premises, for our claim.
Yeah. When you have an outcome that is not necessarily one way or another way, when there's a spectrum of outcomes in the middle, that's when that applies. It's not always that the best solution is in the middle. It could be on one of the extremes. Mm-hmm. And that gets overlooked oftentimes.
So there's just so many fun ones. One of my other favorite ones is called the Texas Sharpshooter, and I like it because it just has a funny kind of reasoning for where it kind of came from. It's also called the false cause or the cherry picking fallacy. And it's called the Texas Sharpshooter because it was originally coined after a marksman shooting at barns and then painting bullseyes targeted around the spot where the most bullet holes appeared.
Oh, yeah.
Shotgun and shooting at a barn and going, well, where are the biggest holes? Oh, yeah, that's totally where my bullseye was, yeah. But we do that when we cherry pick data. And we say, well, of course, my reasoning is logical. Look at all of this information that supports my claim. We see that a lot especially with deniers of various sorts. So-called kind of, Google doctors. Love, and I love to Google things too. But when people will say, oh, I've done my research, that's usually a red flag that maybe there's a cherry picking thing going on or a Texas sharpshooter fallacy about to happen, because they'll name tons of studies that tend to sound like they support what they're saying, but they don't give any real credence or lip service or even a mention of things that may also be against what they're saying and maybe in more what's the word I'm looking for? Volume. So have you guys ever seen anything like that or any examples?
Well, to me, it sounds like it's related to a bias that we normally have, where we seek out information that already confirms what we believe. So you listen to conservative radio, so you only see viewpoints that support what you already taught. and it's kind of related to picking out data that supports the conclusion you want to get to. To me, those seem kind of related there.
Well, how hard is it? How hard is it to just take the time to read the opposing point of view on some belief that you hold to be true? Like, most people just don't spend any time reading about the opposing argument. All they do is read about the things that they already agree with, and it just locks you in a prison.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead.
were any of you like particularly religious before? I mean, I'm sure I've asked this question 100
Yes,
times, but
I was.
and
All
when
in.
you were particularly religious, would you say that did you read secular material?
No. I mean, once I started really doing it, I was like, oh, well, religion's ridiculous. But it was my bias that just locked me, would not open up the door to reading things of opposing points of view, because I thought they were evil, trying to talk me out of this righteous way.
I honestly just wasn't allowed access to certain things. You know, my parents just wouldn't let me have the things that I would need to get to where I am today.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think the Texas sharpshooter is an example of a fallacy that's oftentimes committed deliberately. You know, where some of the other fallacies, you could commit them inadvertently, you know, without realizing that you're using false logic. But this one, you know, when you're cherry picking data, that's a very deliberate kind of act. And you see oftentimes, I believe, politicians do that on both sides, obviously. You know, I'm not picking sides here. But I think politicians very often will cherry pick data to support some kind of policy or something like that. And, you know, that's where hopefully, you know, we have a educated journalist that will challenge that and fact check and all this and, you know, bring up the opposing point of views and stuff like that. And I think that's part of, you know, oftentimes I remember when I was in college, you know, you'd write some kind of argumentative paper or something like that. And, you know, your professor will tell you, okay, well, you got to list, you know, some of the opposing views, you know, because you cherry pick some data that supports your argument, but you got to at least in passing, you know, mention some opposing points of view, some challenges, this and that, just so that the reader is aware of it. And, you know, that would be the correct way probably to write a paper or an opinion piece in a newspaper or publication of some kind, but very seldom is that really done. And oftentimes it is very deliberate.
Yeah. And just speaking of deliberate, you know, it's interesting because we also have so many other different fallacies that also can be used very deliberately. And often, actually, we use them deliberately, sometimes without knowing we're doing it deliberately. But when we're trying to defend ourselves, when we're trying to defend our arguments, if we're not aware of how to create a strong argument, we often accidentally, on purpose, resort to for example, the burden of proof fallacy is one that we often use when we're trying to defend ourselves against accusations or even just disbelief. And we give somebody what we believe to be our evidence and say, prove me wrong. The burden of proof says that if we are making the claim, it is our responsibility to prove the claim. We have that burden, but we err in our reasoning when we assume other people have to prove us wrong because we've asserted what we've claimed. So a great example of that is the teapot orbiting Jupiter. If I said that there was a teapot orbiting Jupiter, and somebody said, well, that's obviously preposterous. There couldn't possibly be a teapot orbiting Jupiter. But I said, well, fine, then go prove it.
Yeah, and the sad thing, you know, the bad thing about that fallacy is the best answer you can have for that is, well, there's no reason to think there is, and that just sounds very unsatisfactory as an answer. Well, there's no reason to think that.
Right, and so the people
it's uncomfortable.
Say, well, you didn't offer enough proof to prove me wrong, therefore I'm still right. Now we obviously can say, yes, that's a ridiculous answer. or a ridiculous example, but ridiculous examples often show us what might be considered credible otherwise. So when I say I believe in a deity, and I hate to keep reverting to that, but when I say that, people might say, well, I don't believe you. And I say, well, I've given you this proof and this proof. If you don't believe me, you need to prove that there's no God. That's not the way. That is the burden of proof fallacy at work.
Right.
Yeah. And honestly, the best way to kind of see through this haze that's being thrown at you, and that sometimes you might be giving, is to just as often as possible to just take the null hypothesis position. Mm-hmm. To basically assume that there is a good enough reason to think that there's a correlation between Y and Z, whatever it happens to be. So in any particular claim, you should take the null hypothesis position until presented with facts that lead you one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, and that brings me to another fun one. You said, I mean, there's so many, and I guess we might want to take a moment and just even talk about where we got interested in fallacies, because this is where I really got interested in them.
I would like to, can you tell me, Chris, can you tell me too, like what kind of impact it had on you too in your story?
Sure, absolutely. So when I started reading about fallacies, I didn't actually learn about them until I was probably in my mid to late 20s, when I went to college and I was taking a philosophy course. It was a basic philosophy course. And I thought, hey, I'm a fairly intelligent guy. Here we are, we're in this class, and the professor gives us this argument and asks people to pick a side, to argue their sides. And so there's a fairly good conversation going on between some people. And then I jump in with, well, I don't know if we can really accept any of this yet. And I can't remember exactly what I said, but the professor looked at me and said, you are, what you were saying sounds very intelligent, but it is a complete fallacy, and you're taking us in a direction of a tangent. And I went, what? What are these things? Okay. So I started learning about it when people started pointing out my errors. And it took me a while before I started reading about some of them. But then when I started reading about them, they were kind of a fun game to find. And I actually started really enjoying stand-up comedy a lot more, because I started recognizing that a lot of the comedy that we enjoy, a lot of the stand-up comedy event especially, is actually the jokes, the punchlines come from fallacies being made. For example, what's his name? Oh, great. Mitch Hedberg. His whole sets were built on non sequitur fallacies. And that's all he would do, is just sit there and try to make non sequitur means no connection. So he would try to take something and the punchline would be that he would say something that sounded like it should have a connection, but actually had no connection. And it was just hilarious. But then I started recognizing them, and it was great. Ambiguity is where our wordplay comes from. Ambiguity is a fallacy. It's an error in reasoning. So, for example, if I said, when the judge asked the defendant why he hadn't paid his parking fines, he said he shouldn't have to pay them because the sign said, quote, "Fine for parking here," end quote. And so he naturally presumed that it would be fine to park here. Ha, ha, ha. See, it's funny.
That's an awesome example. Yeah.
But that became very interesting to me and how we use it in our comedy. But we can recognize them when it makes us laugh, but then we don't recognize when we're doing it because we're serious. Right. And that made me want to start reading more about them. So anybody else?
Yeah, I do. I was blown away by them. In fact, every time I step back into fallacies, I just get amazed at how deep they run in us. Our entire belief structures are built on fallacies and fallacy on fallacy on fallacy. If you haven't actually analyzed why you believe what you believe on any topic, it's likely that there's all kinds of fallacies built into your assumptions. So when I can't remember exactly what led me to them, but when I did understand them for the first time, I just was like, man, I have just been a total big bag of BS for as long. I just think about how, I don't know if anybody found it as impacting as I did, but I was a grown man before I understood what a fallacy was, and I just found them everywhere. And it just makes me marvel that that's how the vast majority of the population is. Just kind of led by bias and fallacy. And it's amazing how little we know and how confident we are about it.
Yeah, the first time I heard of fallacies was when I was watching some debates and some TV shows and stuff like that, and some of the hosts started bringing up, oh, well, this is a fallacy, that's a fallacy, and I understood what they were saying, but I had never thought that there are so many, fallacies or failures of logic that we commit every day. And I even, in some of the arguments that I had heard that were fallacious, I recognized, that I was doing the same thing oftentimes. Like the false dichotomy. Like that's definitely something that I've used before, and I try to recognize it and not do that anymore. Or, for example, there's another interesting fallacy that we haven't brought up yet, but it's called the no true Scotsman. You hear that all the time. And oftentimes it's presented as, oh, well, he's not a real Christian if he doesn't do that. And it's like, okay, well, how do you define what a real Christian is?
Yeah, this is real big with the Catholics, man. They, because Catholics make up I think the majority of Christians, I'm pretty sure. And they'll spew the no Scotsman fallacy left and right. Those aren't, even with other Catholics, there are different breeds of Catholicism. And
isn't that where denomination comes from and different sects?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the No True Scotsman one reminds me of an old show that was great way back in the day, and I'm probably dating myself, but it was called The State, and it was a sketch comedy troupe, kind of like Kids in the Hall, and they did one called Bearded Men of Space Station 11, and it was a skit about how all these people living on Space Station 11, and they got a message saying, okay, researchers have decided, they've discovered that no one can grow beards in space, but there they all are standing there with beards. And one of the guy looks at him and says, but Commander, and he's like, yep, no beards in space. Apparently it's just not possible according to the researchers. And the guy looks at him and says, but we all have beards. And they all look at each other and go, nope, no real person in space can grow a beard. And it made me laugh because we see that so often, and we see that usually when people are involved in trying to prove themselves somehow, and it related to another fallacy. And fallacies are often working in tandem or working in conjunction with each other. They're not usually set alone, but usually you see the No True Scotsman one in conjunction with the moving the goalposts.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Mm.
When you say, oh, well, if you really want to be in our club, frat, whatever, then you should do this, this, and this. And they say, oh, well, you say, okay, well, I've done all these things. And they say, well, actually, if you really were able to do this, then you see the goalposts move. You see the requirements change. And it's kind of the flip side of that coin.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the ones that'll get people frustrated too. Those are the ones that cause problems.
Yeah,
because that gets old real quick.
Yeah, and we see it in economic stature or classes too, where people say, "Oh, well, I'm not upper class yet. I'm not really upper class," when they're swimming in a yacht. They're saying, "Well, I'm not middle class because," or whatever, and they're saying basically, "I'm not a true whatever." That argument can be kind of insidious that way. So we see it kind of hold down economic classes quite a bit by excluding them, using the no true Scotsman and the moving the goalpost. But let's see, Caleb or
Yeah.
I forgot. Did you get a chance to chime in yet on whether or not you ever had any experiences with fallacies before? Or?
Oh, well.
Do you guys? Yeah, go ahead, Caleb.
Oh, okay. Well, my introduction into fallacies was really thrust at me when I got into the Four Horsemen. They really got me to think about it. They were very open about using the word fallacy, fallacious, illogical, these sorts of terms, which is, common in the debate realm, but it was religion in particular that brought me to this realm. And the Four Horsemen were definitely leading the pack there. And
who tell our audience who the Four Horsemen are?
The Four Horsemen are Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and I think it was Michael Shermer. Was it? No, hold on, I forgot his name.
Richard Dawkins.
Yes, that's what it was. Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, they definitely.
I've kind of fallen away from Dawkins, obviously, in lately. I think that don't get me wrong. I don't think he's wrong on a lot of things. I just think he's I don't know, not my flavor, I guess is how I'll phrase it.
Well, you shouldn't have to go with the bandwagon on him. You can't. You don't everything he says, but and I think
that's one of the reasons
have been major. Popularizers, is that a word?
Popularizer.
Sure. Yeah, there we go. Popularizers of debate and a call back to reasoning and understanding of logic and understanding of fallacy and really trying to point out where it's not being used and using it to question. So that's, I think they've all been, and there's so many other people who likewise have done so. That's an interesting place, but I think we're starting to get a little low on time. So I just wanted to
still got about 5 minutes, I think.
Okay. I just wanted to get to one last question. We've been talking about all these fallacies, and we've kind of talked about some of our personal experiences over things like that. But one big question I think a lot of people might have on their mind when they start hearing about it is, so what's the big deal? We said often people live lives that may be very steeped in fallacy, and you might even get to a point where you say, well, if you start pulling out that house of cards, you're going to cause some real damage to these people. What are the dangers of fallacy?
The dangers are in believing them, not pulling the rug out. You have to pull the rug out. I mean, that is a fallacy in and of itself, thinking that makes the world better. But I guess I'm just going to go out there and
there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of people out there that believe that believing a few things that are wrong or making a few arguments that are wrong, it can improve your life. But I also, I very much disagree with that. I think there is no way for your life to be improved by believing false things. I think if you believe true things that are real without fallacies, deal with them, that is, the only way to actually improve your life, to move forward. Because a lot of people will say, well, but for some people, maybe if they believe in God, that improves their life. Or if they believe that, tomorrow they're going to win the lottery, maybe that drives them to live, one more day and or something like that. I don't know. But I think those are all false. I think if if we believe true things, deal with them, deal with reality on reality's terms, don't commit fallacies, we live better lives.
I kind of operate from the assumption that civilization is like the highest standard. And I also operate under the assumption that civilization is a product of like busting through bias and fallacy, science discovering new ways that the world works and how we can live together and make all this stuff great. So I just think that civilization is pretty awesome and it's worth preserving. And this is the one thing that I think civilization is a product of. So I don't know. That's why I believe it.
Yeah, I can go along with that.
Amen.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned that that is a fallacy in and of itself, and you're right. And I'll introduce what that fallacy is. It's called the sunken cost fallacy, and it's another one that actually can lead to some very real dangers, especially in gambling. We see it in gambling addiction time. The fallacy is that, well, I've got too much invested. If I walk away now, then it's going to be terrible, and I can't possibly afford to walk away from it. I've got too much going inside it. And the same thing goes with, well, there's nothing, it's not really hurting me. Why walk away from it now? It's this sunken cost fallacy that you can't, or that you've got too much invested. And it reminds me of a quote from Carl Sagan, who said, "It is far better to grasp the universe as it really is than to persist in delusion, however satisfying and reassuring." And I think he really touched on that notion of, while the world as it really is can sometimes be really painful, it can really be difficult to deal with. It can be difficult to deal with uncertainty when we want to believe something or when we don't want to believe something. It can be difficult to handle emotions. It can be difficult to handle pain when it is based on something that is real or that is part of reality. And we can often turn to things that make us feel much better, that can reassure us that everything's going to be okay. And I know for a fact that I've been in high stress situations where I really didn't know if I was going to get out of it. And there were times when I was just so tempted to just say, you know what, I will believe anything right now if it saves my butt. Or if it can reassure me that everything's going to be okay here, particularly as a parent.
Yeah.
Those times we really reach for something to make us feel better. And often find them in fallacy.
That belief that everything is going to be okay, that like, oh, God's going to take care of it. That can be a very, very damaging belief. And I think that's more of a bias, of the ingrained religion in us that God's going to take care of it. And that can really make you not plan for the future. You fail to plan for the future. When you fail to plan, you plan to fail, kind of thing. And so, it again comes down to, you got to deal with reality in reality's terms, and things will be better that way. Not if you just believe false things and you commit fallacies and all that to make yourself feel better in the very moment.
And so we've talked about how it can keep people kind of in a false world and provide a lot of false hope, and that can be damaging psychologically.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.